Hi, this is Steve. This podcast is talking about what we know about the medical interventions, colloquially known as something rhyming with the English composer Arnold Bax. So I will use the terms medical interventions and Arnold Bax through this podcast in order to avoid censorship. Yes, folks, other than on Twitter, and only then due to Elon Musk, this sort of game to avoid censorship is sadly necessary. That's the state of transparency of information and opinion in our so-called democracy these days. For the same reason, I will use the term airborne bad guy for the core issue we all know I'm talking about. So it is now clear from official UK data and the Pfizer data on the original Arnold Bax trials, that I remind you they had to be forced to release, that these medical interventions were unnecessary for the majority of the population, insufficiently effective, and for the vast majority, more dangerous than efficacious. See the video of the official data from Dr. John Campbell called Numbers Needed to Vaccinate Data. I've put the link in the description. This data is newly released and for the autumn of 2022 Arnold Bax, but other videos show the same issues with the initial trialing and earlier versions of the Arnold Bax. See the recent videos on Dr. John Campbell's YouTube channel with Professor of Risk and Data Analysis Norman Fenton, also in the description. Professor Fenton recently had a complaint upheld about the statistics compiled by the Office for National Statistics, the ONS, which were used to make policy decisions over the last 3 years. Simply, the ONS were forced to concede that there were so many problems with their data that they must not be used to make policy decisions. Oops, too late. Anyway, I'll give you a quick quote from this latest video. It is now clear from the officially released data that the risk of an adverse event from the autumn Arnold Bax is greater than the risk of hospitalization from the airborne bad guy. End quote. The data also shows, of course, that the risk of an adverse event from the Arnold Bax is greater still than the risk of requiring ventilation or oxygen in hospital, and de facto, the risk of an adverse event from the Arnold Bax is orders of magnitude greater than the risk of death from the airborne bad boy itself. This was all known by those on the relevant Public Health Authorising Committee. They get the data ahead of the public, yet it was still promoted by governments and public health authorities across the Western liberal democracies. Why? This is now clearly and beyond doubt a public health scandal of the highest magnitude. And surely it's now clear what happened back in 2020. But frankly, some of this was clear to independent-minded people at the time. Number one, catalyzed by the totalitarian response of the Chinese Communist Party, panic gripped the Western liberal democracies. The cushier your life, the easier you are to scare. So panic gripped the Western liberal democracies, including the throwing out of the existing agreed response protocols to a pandemic of exactly this sort. Only Sweden didn't do that, and they have done better than the rest, including the subsequent excess deaths. Go figure. Point two, the imposition of measures which only a few months earlier, public health officials and government spokespeople were giving interviews about, saying were not the way to do things. So mask wearing, lockdowns, etc., ensued. A total volte-face with no new credible information. And by credible, I mean independent of government or big pharma influence. Point three, the pharmaceutical companies whose only legal duty is to make as much money from their shareholders as possible, couldn't risk financially not being as fast to market with their version of the Arnold Bax as their competitors. So instead of a conventional, tried and tested Arnold Bax, they used, because it would be quicker, a new untried technology which is not a true Arnold Bax, but rather a form of gene manipulation. The WHO definition of an Arnold Bax was subsequently altered to include this new gene manipulation method. Corners were cut. We'll tell them that throwing enough money at it equates to long-term trials. It does not. Indeed, it cannot. You cannot buy time from the future. And to demonstrate the safety of their Arnold backs, trial data was either manipulated via deliberately poor trialing methods or manipulated via the willful misinterpretation of their own data. Point 4. The regulators, who are the ones charged with ensuring that any medical intervention meets certain safety standards, and who are in large part funded by the pharma companies, by the way, came under huge political pressure from the public health establishment, the media, and politicians of all parties. So instead of insisting that the pharma company trials were correctly assessed over the long term, which is basically 3 years, and that the data was independently assessed, they took the pharma company's word for it and effectively licensed the Arnold Baxters into the public domain on the nod. And before anyone says, oh, but they didn't know the airborne bad guy wasn't as harmful as first feared, by the time the Arnold Baxters were licensed, they absolutely did know. Point 5. The vast amounts of money, having been either already paid out or contractually committed to by this point, meant there was no turning back due to moral cowardice, and required a willful propaganda program to gain widespread public acceptance. The government's nudge unit, it's a public propaganda unit, kicked into action, and with the full compliance of the public health authorities and media, pumped out information the truth claims of which they either knew were false, either in whole or via exaggeration, or knew they didn't actually know whether what they were saying was true or not, yet they stated it as fact, as the science, of which there is no such thing, of course. So we now know that the Arnold Baxters were neither tested to see if they prevented the future contracting of the airborne bad guy, nor whether having the Arnold backs prevented passing on the airborne bad guy to other people. Yet they got presidents, prime ministers, the entire political establishment, and most Western countries, the heads of public health regulation, and all the media organizations to repeatedly make exactly those claims. And worse, to vindictively pillory and cancel anyone, however well credentialed, from coming to the attention of the general public. We have known for some time now that those claims were false, and known to be so by those making them as they were being made. Or if they didn't know, they should have done. The pharmaceutical companies most certainly knew those claims were false, yet did nothing to stop them being made. I'll finish with an example of the way fear propaganda skews the behavior of the unthinking or deeply fearful. I was in a doctor's surgery only yesterday, and there was an older chap, late 60s, 70, wearing a mask in the waiting room. Okay, I'm not going to quibble with that. He was the only one, but he dropped his mask and with no handkerchief or tissue, sneezed and then replaced his mask. And there, in a nutshell, is where unthinking compliance to deliberately fear-inducing propaganda gets you. Totally illogical behavior. If he has the airborne bad guy, he's just sneezed it out for the rest of us to breathe in. If he hasn't, he's just taken his mask off, and in his mind, although we know the standard masks are useless, it says so on the box, exposed himself to the airborne bad guy the rest of us may be breathing into the air. Totally illogical behavior. How many years it will be before these blatant errors of judgment, many of them moral errors, are admitted to, I don't know, but the dam has been breached, so hopefully it will be sooner rather than later. What we can say with almost 100% certainty is that none of the people involved in this will be brought to any form of meaningful justice, which means it's more than likely that this sort of thing will happen again in the future. Thanks for listening.